Because I wonder if part of your election strategy, in fact, I don't wonder, I know that part of your election strategy has to be based around independence. Deputy First Minister, can you outline for us what your plan is to achieve independence?
So I think the first and primary responsibility we have is to inspire hope. So the next election is going to be a question of what Scotland's future looks like. And I really don't think we can overemphasise at the moment the risks of extremism and the risks of populism. So when people feel left behind, as I've just outlined, that I think they do, because living standards haven't increased, because of systematic failures that affect the United Kingdom and other Western democracies, because of that, people feel left behind. And they will listen to voices that simplify the solutions to quite an alarming extent and pose dangerous solutions. So it's the immigrant to blame for absolutely everything. Divide communities, divide societies, lead to an increase in hate and all the rest of it. And on the other side, we have a responsibility to outline a better alternative. And First Minister said yesterday in his speech that we can fix everything that's wrong in Scotland with everything that's right in Scotland. We know we have got everything that it takes. We know that we are going to power, for example, the road to net zero. We know we have the energy resources. We know they have the skills, the talent. You know, if Ireland's looking at the moment this year at a budget surplus that they don't know how to spend, the point is that we plucky countries can do a great job if they believe in themselves. And that is an alternative future that is filled with hope, it's filled with aspiration, filled with ambition, filled with prosperity. And the route to independence is about outlining that alternative that can inspire. Now, we need to ensure that people believe us. And that is where trust comes in. And what the First Minister has done over the last 6 months, trying to bring people together, of setting out a competent, straightforward approach to delivery, is the answer to the trust point. Combine those two, and I think you've got an electric solution.
So it's more about that. I mean, I think that's an interesting point. And it comes back a little bit to the timescales I was talking about earlier. 2026, using that logic, will be at least as much about, look, this is where we're going, as much as it's about, look at what we've done in the last couple of years. You're going to have to be pretty heavy on, you got to trust us, we must have proven something to you over the last couple of years, and now look at all this stuff we've got planned, which kind of comes back to a point I made about the really, really high-level, big, ambitious, 10, 20, 30-year plans that I think people would respond well to. But it's going to have to be heavy on that because there's not enough time to actually...
It's got to be heavy on that because of what's at stake. I mean, there's a lot at stake in the next election about where we go. And you just go back to those by-elections, you look at the support for reform that's increasing, you look at what's been in the news this week. There's a lot at stake in 2026.
Can I just say, though, based on what you've said, the immediate perception of that is that almost feels like a step one on the route to independence. Fine. But then I don't know how you get to step two. Am I missing something?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, sold. As a committed nationalist, sold. What you just said, brilliant.
It's not just nationalists that would be sold on that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the point I was trying to make earlier, right?
Yeah. The point is you want more people to be sold on that vision.
No.
If we can convince Andy, then we're halfway there.
I'm sold on the vision. And I hate to talk too much process, but we've been promised referendum after referendum regularly over the last 10 years. We've gone to the Supreme Court. We now know by law that that Holyrood is not permitted to the UK government does not have to give consent to that referendum. How do you convince Westminster if independence referendum is your preferred route? What is your preferred route? How are you going to make the case for independence? What's going to be in the manifesto? I accept we're not going to get the detail just now. But how is it going to be different to what's gone before, First Minister? How is it going to be different to gone before?
Well, what I've said consistently is that Scottish independence will only come about, whatever discussion we have about routes and process, when there's an emphatic desire for Scottish independence. And that's exactly what the Deputy First Minister has just talked about how we inspire people to believe in that concept of independence and why that will have the transformative effect on our lives, that we as believers in independence think that's going to be the case. And that's got to be at the heart of how we promote the arguments for independence, how we use those international comparisons, how we demonstrate good governance within Scotland, how we show people that there are many good things can be done in Scotland and there are many more things could be done that are good for Scotland if we had the powers of independence. So that's about, and if I look back over political history, and there's a very easy conclusion to come to. Nothing ever happens on the constitutional question unless the SNP is doing really well. And that's the hard reality of life. So we've got to get people to buy into an inspiring vision of independence and see voting SNP as the means to catalyse that and to make it happen. And ultimately, in a democracy, Westminster cannot stand in the way of the people of Scotland determining their own future. And that's
measured by what, though? So the Northern Irish...
Because in a democratic context, that cannot be... If you take in the context of Northern Ireland, for example, there is an accepted
so that's what I was
point.
Is this what you were talking
so
about?
There's an accepted point about there is a route by which this issue is addressed.
Yeah.
So if there's an acceptance that there is a route by which this can be addressed for Northern Ireland, there has to be an acceptance of a route for Scotland that cannot be resisted. That's my point to you, Calum. That is just a logical democratic inconsistency that can't be sustained.
But do you like that? So that particular route, which
I'm talking about the fact that there is an accepted
there is a
route.
Okay.
And so I'm not pontificating about the route. I'm talking about the fact there is an acceptance that there's a route, a pathway, and that cannot be resisted. That cannot be accepted in Northern Ireland and somehow
so you would discuss with Starmer some sort of codification of a route?
These are issues that we've got to consider as to how we progress. But fundamentally, it will only come when there is political impetus behind the campaign for independence, and that's what we are working to make sure is the case.
Was Nicola Sturgeon wrong to refer all of this to the Supreme Court in the first place?
I mean, if you look back over the last few years, the fundamental thing that is wrong is the denial of democracy. So at the end of the day, it should be really obvious that when people vote for a party to be in power and in their manifesto, they set out what they will do in power,
so
like having a referendum.
You disagree with the Supreme Court
I think it's really clear that that is the route forward. And over that period of time, the SNP made a number of attempts to go down that route, and that was one of them.
And so was that a mistake, do you think, First Minister?
Wasn't a mistake. Because we've got to, and we have, explore every avenue possible to advance the ability to deliver on the mandate that was being expressed by the people of Scotland. But I come back to my fundamental point. You will only deny democracy if you're not prepared to embrace what we now see as growing levels of support for Scottish independence as expressed in a consistent set of polls at a higher level than has been the case for some considerable time.
But that will, sorry, just to be clear, in your manifesto, you will have a clear route map as to what your preferred vision of how you achieve independence.
Just to remind you what you said a few minutes ago, we're not going to be writing our manifesto.
I know, but I mean...
So it was a good and valiant attempt, but it's ultimately flawed and failed.
But you don't have to tell us what it is. Do you know what it is?
I've got a very clear sense about how we need to progress on the constitutional question
and how we can break that logjam. Well, if you had that conversation,
yes.
Yeah, you've had that conversation.
But we talk about a lot of things.
So you both know that. So you both know what the route is. You're both on the same page.
We are on the same page.
And that page will be in the manifesto.
Well, that's what Geoff's asking me about what the details of the manifesto are, and I'm just not prepared to.
I mean, it'd be weird if you didn't have independence in your manifesto, wouldn't it? Yeah, fine, good.
It's hard because. I mean, in my view, I've said this before, there should have been a referendum because I think 2016 was different because it was caveated in the Brexit vote and all that stuff. 2021 was pretty clear. You had a majority for two parties that had identical wording in their manifesto, and it was very clear that it was a vote for a referendum. There should have been one, but I think that belligerence by the UK government, and that's what it was, I think it was democratically unacceptable at the time. It has given the SNP a real difficulty in what the pitch then is, because if all avenues look like they're closed, it makes the pitch hard and raises more answers than questions.
I think it's fundamentally bigger, and it goes back. I'm going to keep banging this drum about trust, because you asked me a question about trust and the dangers of extremism. When people feel left behind, they feel ignored, They don't feel things get delivered. If you look at some of the, I think it was just before the election, and John Curtis did a piece about trust and the lack of, apathy, disillusionment. And he said that those that believed most in constitutional change felt most left behind by politicians that hadn't been able to deliver on what they wanted to deliver. In other words, people that believed that hope was possible and that things could change felt completely left behind. And that lack of hope, that anxiety, that despair, that is where extremism flourishes. And so the point about denying democracy is massive. It's fundamental to the next election.
Short-term hard for nationalists, but long-term bad for unionists.
It's a thread that runs through every single policy, and I think it needs to shift.
And just final point on this, very, very quickly. I mean, I recognise the point you make about the SNP, and for what it's worth, I tend to agree with you, First Minister, about being the prominent force for independence. But there are other parties, and one thing I think that the pro-independence campaign did very well in 2014 is speak to all. I don't have much in common with Patrick Harvey, but I certainly respected his ability in that campaign and his views, why he supported Scottish independence. And we managed to put that together pretty well. Is there a role for other parties in this independence debate going forward, as you see it? Is there a role for them? And would you support their existence on the list, for example, in 2026?
Well, I think political parties will express their points of view and they'll set out their stall. From my point, as leader of the Scottish National Party, I'll try to get as many people as I possibly can do to vote for the Scottish National Party in every election and give the leadership that we've always given to the constitutional question, because I come back to my fundamental point, Geoff. Nothing happens on the Constitution in Scotland without the Scottish National Party doing really well.